So, if you haven't watched the introduction to the Integral series, go do that. It'll probably be up here somewhere. Today, we're going to be talking about a particular aspect of theory that I think is really important for us to look at and understand. And the part we're going to be looking at today is states of being. So what do I mean when I say states of being? Well, another way to say this is states of consciousness. One of the things that is still a big question in humanity is what is consciousness? We still don't fucking know. And what is a state experience? That is, when someone sees God, is that just random neurons firing, or is there something else happening? Are they actually seeing God? Is there any way we can even know that? What about, say, a Buddhist monk who sits for years and years and years and meditates, only to find themselves in a state of absolute emptiness? How do you reconcile these different state experiences? If all of these people are engaging in some sort of spiritual practice, and that spiritual practice is causing them to go into these states of being to get closer to God or oneness or Allah or whatnot, how can they all be right? Now, the academic answer would be you read Coming Home by Lex Hickson, and you basically see how all of them are essentially pointing at the same thing, and it's really just evangelicals and crazy people that don't really seem to understand how spirituality works. Barring reading that book, which by the way is a fantastic book, Lex Hickson, Coming Home, I highly recommend it. It doesn't actually disclose what those different stages or different states are. So, in Wilber's theory, one of the things he did was take a particular school of Buddhism, known as Vajrayana, I believe, if my history is correct. I might have this a bit wrong, but if I remember correctly, Vajrayana comes from essentially Buddhists making their way to Tibet, finding a whole bunch of cool shamans there that did a lot of really cool shamanic shit, known as the Bone Shaman, and then proceeded to, they sort of fusion hod their shit together. And the map they created not only went into disclosed states of being as far as like different places after death, like Bardo realms, but also went into really interesting shit as far as different states of being along the way, because you had suddenly these two very diametrically, these very dissonant, that's better language, dissonant sort of faiths come together to see how there's these different aspects. And their map was very complex. You know, if you had a dream about fucking your teacher, they could point on the map and say, oh, you're roughly here, right? And they would treat that as a serious thing. Wilber took that mapping because it seemed to be so exhaustive and basically just attributed that to every other faith. And it seems to fit. Here's how. So, if we look at this model, see if I can get it a little bigger for you guys. For right now, I want you to ignore this stuff on the side. We'll be coming back to this next time. But for right now, I want you to look at these 4 phrases. Okay? So, roughly, if you look at any spiritual tradition, whether that is Zen, Christianity, mystic Islam, Shinto, Western shamanism, all of their states of experience, whether they are exogenously induced, see if I can use the word properly, that is, say they take a drug or a hallucinogen, versus endogenously induced, thus through meditation, prayer, etc. So we're talking about exogenous states, that is things that come from outside, or endogenous states, things that come from inside. And roughly, at least in my opinion, both are really useful, both are really good. The problem is that one of them can get you somewhere really fast, but it's sort of like just giving a new partner no brakes, and yeah, it's going to go where it's going to go. The other one takes more diligence and time, but you have a lot more familiarity with it. regardless of the source of that state of experience, every faith's description of some sort of spiritual awakening or spiritual engagement can break down to these 4 phrases. And so let me explain what each of them mean. The first one is gross. And we don't mean like disgusting. We mean gross as in very just gross reality. Reality exists as a very clear, there are objects, there are rules, right? There are physics. If I pick something up and drop it, it falls. If I slap myself, there's an engagement, right? There's motion, there's force, there's all this kind of stuff. Just gross phenomenon. And the thing about gross phenomenon is that it's got pretty hardcore rules. They're very locked in place, save for some, deep levels of string theory and quantum mechanics. For the most part, they're unbreakable. Maybe gravity can do some shit to them, but we're not gravity. So we assume that they're, for the most part, unbreakable. So does that make sense on gross phenomenon? We're just talking about sort of baseline reality. You're walking around, you're walking down the street, you're interacting with things. There's a ground, there's a sky. You're walking through things. You can feel the clothing on your back, the wind in your hair. Does this make sense as a very baseline thing that we're starting from? No matter what prayer, what meditation, no matter what thing you're doing, this is where you're coming from. I wouldn't say necessarily modifications, but yes, I would say instead of modifications, I would say altered states of consciousness. Modifications seem like they're altering gross. I would actually say to some degree, these are all, how do I say this? They all can be experienced discretely, even though there isn't actually any lines there. That is, they all do seem to flow into one another, but but for the purposes of discussion, for the purposes of languaging, we're just going to make some hard lines here. Where that line would exactly go depends, but they're all sort of part of the same thing. Gross is just the baseline aspect of it. The next is subtle. And we don't mean subtle as in like I'm trying to be dodgy about some shit. Someone dodging around the idea of saying someone's hot, that kind of stuff. Subtle in this case can actually kind of point to 2 separate phenomenon, but really if you think about them, are basically the same. Subtle phenomenon can be things like in the low subtle, which could be thoughts and feelings. These exist in some ways, not in a gross way. We know they're real. That is, you experience feelings and thoughts, and they appear to be a very real phenomenon, but they don't have the same gross reality that, say, knocking on my desk would. Right? So this would fall into things that are part of like Whitehead's fallacy of simple location. The idea is that a thing can exist even if there isn't a way to point directly at it. So emotions, thoughts, intuition, anything that goes into essentially understanding the parts of the phenomenon of being human that are not just part of gross reality. Non-concretes then, yeah, to some degree. So another example of this would be high subtle. So what does things like Reiki, certain types of shamanism, praying and seeing angels, feeling presences of other people, what do all of those things have in common? And I know for someone who's a hardcore atheist, they're going to say hallucinations, but bear with me. We are coming into this in good faith. What do they all seem to have in common? Anyone? Feeling something internally that appears externally? You're on the right track, guys. How about, let me see if I can put it in a much more succinct way. They all exist on dream logic. That is that in dream logic, things that are magical or based in magical thinking, right? The psychological term magical thinking, that is believing there is causality where there is none. Each of those functions in some ways the way a dream would. If I can take energy from my body or from the ambient life around me, in the case of Reiki, and use it to affect someone in a positive way, that sort of follows under a magical thinking way. And it's not like people don't experience something to this. They're not just lying to themselves. We know this for a fact. There's research on Reiki. People seem to generally think that stuff works on them. Whether it actually is or not, or it's psychosomatic, there's debates. But the person doing it feels something, and generally the person who's getting it also can feel something. Someone sees an angel, our natural thing is to say, oh, they're having a hallucination. But in reality, we don't actually know that. In fact, I would argue that these types of states of experience, these states of consciousness, kind of are, I think, part of our birthright as human beings, as sort of the top pinnacle of consciousness on the planet. There's a lot of bumps and bruises we get on along the way on that one. There's no one before us that kind of proves how to do this, right? And so the problem is there's not a good way to describe this stuff in some ways. Tiamat said in chat, associative meaning rather than direct meaning. Yeah, in a way, that's kind of what dreams are in a sense, right? But there's still a reality to it. All of those things that I described, a person basically just experiences. There are ways in which they follow under dream logic. And in dreams, like again, gravity may or may not work. In dreams, you might be able to fly. In dreams, you might be able to experience teleportation, right? There's no such thing as distance, even though in the gross world, there absolutely is distance. So these are subtle states. And so if you talk to someone, say, who's pagan or someone who is doing a laying out of hands, some of these people are shysters, sure. But not all of them, I think. I think there's a way that we can sort of include those states of experience into a model to understand, one, that they're valid, and two, they seem to be universal to humanity to varying degrees. I'll even go one step further and say this is that, is it possible that different cultural interpretations are looking at the same associative phenomenon or the same type of phenomenon, but coming to radically different answers because of the cultural lens? That is, between the cultural and the individual meaning-making function of the human mind, wouldn't it make sense that a subtle experience of seeing, like, I don't know, God, or, you know, your dead grandfather, or whoever, depending on your culture, you're going to see different things. For example, in Shinto, you might see your ancestor come to you. In Buddhism, you might see one of the grand Buddhas come to you, or perhaps one of the Taras. In Christianity, one of the saints may come down. The means of production? No, that's actually a very different thing. That is not a state of consciousness. You're describing actually an inter-objective phenomenon. We'll cover that next time when we go over quadrants. Okay? Means of production, the rules of a religion. I disagree with this. I actually think Marx's interpretation of religion is incredibly reductive. I realize there's lots of people that like quoting this and going into atheistic, masturbatory bliss, but I'm really not a fan. There are too many examples within the context of humanity where it seems like something is happening, and it's not just these are control mechanisms to use as a way to inure or to pacify the people, right? Someone had to have the original idea, right? Lightning strikes a tree and all of a sudden there's Zeus, right? We need an explanation for that. Now, does that get used for power later? Yeah, and we can get into that when we talk about quadrants and what stages of development get into that. Trust me, this map is complex. We're just covering a basic. Tiamat said, so it becomes a matter of interpretation. Yes, though I don't know if that interpretation is entirely something that we're fully aware of until certain stages of development. It seems to be something that we don't fully get that we're doing. And in some ways, because we have this tendency to a priori assume the validity of our thought patterns, that means state experiences are immediately treated as true as well. I don't think it's masturbatory bliss. Think some rules of religion are to create a cohesive society. I think so, yes, but I feel like that's a chicken and egg scenario because, again, early tribal societies wouldn't have used this as cohesion. They had cohesion in the form of survival and basically just family systems, right? The people in your village would be your grandfather, your neighbor, your friend. This was survival mentality. I feel like to some degree, the explanations of magical thinking looking at the world really are something that was based on the attempt to create causality where there was none. By causality in this context, I mean cause and effect, right? Lightning strikes a tree. It must be that God is mad at us. Now, do those situations of religion, especially once they're concretized and formalized, do they become ways to cohesive society? Absolutely. And religion can get kind of authoritarian, right? Look up Christo-fascism sometime. Not saying that's not a thing. I just don't know if that's where it starts. And it seems to be even people who are not part of a religion are having these experiences. And we know this to be true. Right? So this isn't a religious thing. We're not talking about religion. We're talking about spirituality. And I know that sounds like a basic white bitch distinction, but there really is a difference. There's the difference of the subjective experience of your relationship to being versus a formalized metaphysical or epistemological claim being made by a particular faith. Right? So, again, subtle phenomenon functions under a sort of dream logic. And there's a way in which this can seem to have very positive effects on people. I would also argue that I've seen individuals, maybe members of the pagan community or stuff like that, or even like hardcore evangelicals, when they do that, like, kind of, David, I wouldn't necessarily say they're dreams. I would say that their perception of reality is their perception of reality is engaging in something akin to a dream, maybe is a good way to say it. I've never held the idea that spirituality is the same thing as religion. Something about the equivalency seems like deliberately misunderstanding to me. Yeah, there are a lot of people that do it. Yes, my IAPS teacher was a Hari fan. I'm trying to apply what I know from his class to this. That makes sense. That's fair. And feel free to ask questions in the AMA thing, like Zena just said. So this is subtle. So my issue with subtle phenomenon is this. They're gorgeous. They're wonderful. You do some hallucinogens, you trip balls. You go to a place, have a bunch of pagans lay hands on you, and it's real warm, and everybody seems to get all gaga, and maybe an orgy breaks out. I don't know, whatever. But, like, there's something happening there, even if it's a psychosomatic phenomenon. I tend to hold the idea of both and. That is, I don't like to come to a conclusion insofar as spiritual experiences because I feel like they're always to some degree post hoc. Something happens and then we judge whether it is right or wrong or whether it's valid rather than knowing that there's not really a way to prove that. Someone experiences something, we have to assume they did. Now, whether that has an effect on reality or people's lives, fuck I know. But what we're trying to do is see a way in which these states of consciousness could be valid. So subtle phenomenon can be very intense, very powerful. And my issue with a lot of the spiritual practices out there that really engage in a lot of these subtle practices is that they tend to be, in my experience, pseudo-addictive. That is, people who really like doing certain entheogens at festivals, right? Music festivals, shit like that. They're not really doing those for their increase of consciousness or their way in which to better engage with the world. They're doing it because it's fun to trip balls at a concert. Because they don't know how to just enjoy the concert in and of itself. I'm not saying being inebriated is a problem. Be inebriated. I don't give a fuck. But when we're talking about the engagement of state experiences, intention really fucking matters on this one, in my opinion. So this is subtle. And I'm going to warn each of you that as we get to the next two, they get real confusing. All right? So bear with me. So, hi Threemonic. Hello, we are doing a discussion about states of consciousness. So it's kind of a difficulty in distinguishing it, entering a state for its own sake or for the sake of using it to understand. Well, and I'll say this. at least if I go by Wilber's argument, and there seems to be some at least case study logic on this, his argument would be, and this is me butchering it to the nines because the guy's way more like academically smart than I am, but essentially his argument would be something to the effect of, at some point you realize that these aren't states of consciousness, they're just consciousness. Going from gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual is just moment to moment. And I'll explain why when we get to the end, but there's a way in which even the perception of these as states of consciousness, differing states of consciousness, is in and of itself still in some ways a distinguishment that doesn't actually exist. So let's get into the last two, and then we'll kind of talk about these on a larger scale. Causal is the hardest one to explain here because we're basically explaining nothing. I'm not being dodgy. I'm being honest. The best way to describe this would be the Zen experience of what is called shunyata, complete emptiness, complete darkness. So causal states of consciousness are essentially where, imagine you sit and meditate, and during your meditation, you realize that something's kind of on the precipice, and rather than run away from it, you just kind of go with it. And then suddenly you realize there's nothing there. And I don't mean that the thing coming up isn't there. That's not there. But the feelings, the apprehension, the anticipation, all of that's gone too. And then all of a sudden, you're gone. I've said in previous discussions that there is no permanent self, and this is what I'm usually pointing to. Zen is usually the best people to point at this, though Sufis can get into it too. But essentially, causal states of being are, you basically just meditate as hard as you can or do enough things that you basically cause your sense of self to dissolve, completely and utterly deconstruct. Now, sorry, my nose is itching. This can happen really one of two ways, voluntarily or involuntarily. This goes back to the exogenous and the endogenous state training. So if we're talking about, for example, exogenous, and let's say you're doing something that's pretty hallucinatory, you may go to a place where even you dissolve, and whether you get there kicking and screaming or you just roll with it is up to you, but we're doing it. But through endogenous training, I'll get to that in a moment, Tiamat. That's a fantastic question. Make sure you put those in the question and answer, though. Can you put that one in that chat? Because I want to make sure I come back to that, but I'm not going to answer it right this second. So, all of a sudden, either through a lot of deep breathing, meditation, staring at a wall, well, and here's where I'm going to throw a little curveball at you, Sin. There's no becoming. If we actually take the arguments of Zen and the notion of what causal is, essentially, there wasn't anyone there to begin with. In fact, really, our sense of self is really just sort of a subtle phenomenon, and when everything collapses, so does that. There appears to be just consciousness, just empty, dark, limitless, vast consciousness. In my order, Hollow Bones, the term that Junpo would use for this in his own model was the notion of, he would kind of point to two different things simultaneously because he was a nutball that way, but essentially he would call it clarity of heart mind. And he would say, from this place, there is no fear, there is only openness, darkness, vastness, imperturbability. Nothing can affect you here because there is no you. There's no one to be affected, and there never has been. Continuing the tradition of Zen trolling. Correct. So I see a lot of people in chat saying this sounds scary, and it can be. It can be real fucking scary, but only in the sense that if you are very attached to your sense of self and you're afraid of essentially metaphorically dying, then yeah, it's going to be kind of terrifying. Junpo used to say this, and I'm saying this as a metaphor, so don't at me fucking YouTube. But Junpo used to say that meditation is ritual suicide. Now, he would say you don't hurt yourself physically. This is not an advocacy for anyone doing anything bad. Don't hurt yourself. he would actually say that that's homicide. You're killing a person, just happens to be you. He would flip the words around and say, to get rid of a self, you commit ritual suicide. On a metaphorical level, you get rid of the self. If you read his book, Heart Blown Open, there's a really interesting scene where he does a fuck ton of meditation, yoga, followed by a lot of fucking LSD. And basically, long story short, during this whole fuck ton of LSD, basically what ends up happening is he disappears. And not only does he go to causal, but we'll move on to the one in a second, but basically his memory of coming out of this state of consciousness is essentially him having to slowly but surely and discreetly separate things out to reconstruct a sense of self versus everything else. This starts with him realizing that A, there is a him, B, he has a tongue, C, that tongue is buried in something, D, that thing is the carpet. Actually, Lucy, you're right. It is. Right? So, if you look, we can actually sort of attribute these middle two states of consciousness to genuine states of consciousness when you sleep. This is why I say they're actually things that everybody does, because the same brain waves and the same brain states that you have when you're doing a subtle phenomenon or you're engaging with a subtle phenomenon are really about the same as they are when you're dreaming. No, Annie, not like solipsism. That is a very different thing. That is in some way ego only exists, is the only thing that does exist. This is the radical opposite of that. The ego utterly deconstructs. Causal would be deep dreamless sleep. There's a part of your sleep where there's just nothing. And you ever notice that even though you don't remember anything from it, you do sort of get the sense that time changes? What's aware of that? It's not you. You're fucking gone. So even though it's a joke, no, sleep's actually a good representation of these, smartass. Yeah, I would argue, Tiamat, that goes one step further. That because these states of experience are by their nature No, that's probably not true, Clueless. I'll come back to that in a second. I'll put a question in there talking about that, or just mention again that you don't dream. I want to come back to that. That's a bigger conversation. But imagine that if you access these states of being, they also do the same effect as sleep. Now, that's not to say that it gets rid of sleep. The body needs to rest as well. But yeah, there's a way in which these things have very real effects on the mind. La Petite Mort is an orgasm, Althea. Thank you. You perv. Someday everyone should ask Althea about the Twizzler thing. So La Petite Mort. Oh no, my 2 years of French that I forgot is coming online. But this is kind of what we're talking about with causal. Essentially, you're going over the cliff. Either voluntarily or not voluntarily, but it doesn't really matter because in the end, there's no you. Who's ever volunteering, it just fucks clean off. Lucy, it's okay. We'll get to it. So there is sort of a middle stage between causal and non-dual that doesn't get talked about because it does seem to exist. That is exactly what's probably happening, Clueless. That is exactly what's happening. If you want to talk about that more, please put that in the AMA chat, though, okay? I want to come back to that. I do think it's important, but I don't want to get on that tangent right now. Right? So imagine, if you can, that your thoughts, your feelings, your preferences, even your senses all deconstruct, and there's just peaceful, radical emptiness. Nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to be. And then in the course of that meditative experience, there's an awareness that comes up. It's not you. But some aspect of consciousness is aware of the emptiness. That is, there is some aspect of consciousness that is not the self, it is not the ego, but is wholly aware of all the emptiness that everything is. It is aware of all that is deconstructing, all that has fallen away, all that returns, and all that falls away again, moment to 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 moment. This is what we would call witness consciousness, or what Jumpo would call pure awareness, or the other part of clear, deep heart mind. The idea that there is an aspect of consciousness that goes beyond the temporary self and is fully aware. One way to do this is actually kind of do an experiment. Notice your body and all the sensations and feelings within it. Then notice your thoughts and your feelings, all the internal phenomenon that's happening. Then take another step back and notice your sense of mind and your sense of self, the isness that is you. Now here's the brain-boiling question. What is aware of all that? Because it's not you. It's not your thoughts and feelings. It's certainly not the body, but it is some aspect of consciousness that is aware of all of this arising. This is the thing, this is the state that mindfulness is aiming for. Actually, that's a good point. Who notices the noticer? Who watches the watcher? Who is the witness? What witness? Even if you're in the worst emotional state humanly possible, there is still part of you that is aware of all of this happening. This is why I often get in trouble for saying that certain types of behaviors, regardless of mental illness or regardless of emotions, are still a choice, because I come from a Zen background. And from Jumpo's perspective, and mine as well, the idea is that if you go back far enough into consciousness, you start to realize that you're fully aware of what you're doing, at least as much as one can be if we want to take some neurological stuff into consideration. So this is sort of the last step. This is the last separation. And I'll explain why that is in a minute. This is the last duality. Subject, object. In Buddhism, this would be called turiya, witness consciousness. This is also what could be called apotheosis, right? Oneness with God. Or we could call this, being one with Allah. So the last separation, what do I mean by that? So notice that gross reality functions on discrete entities engaging in very hardline rules. So at first, all of these discrete and very rigid rules fall away. And then there is subtle phenomenon, thoughts, feelings, later energies, and different types of state experiences, journeys, and things like that, right? Journey in shamanism, etc. But even all the subtle phenomenon, the thoughts, the feelings, even the sense of self, all fall away, leaving just radically empty consciousness, shunyata, emptiness. But within that consciousness, there is a witnessing awareness that is aware of the emptiness and all that is arising and falling away within it. This is the last separation between subject and object. We've cut away every other discrete or separating factor. They all fell away as the illusion they are, at least from a spiritual perspective. And what remains is just subject, object. And then, within the context or the capability of meditation or a state experience that's exogenously brought on, all of a sudden, there is a shift. And suddenly, there is no split. No subject, no object, just mind. Just consciousness. From this depth of mind, there's never been a separation. And all of experience seems to function on some sort of isness, that things are just as they are, but not in this sort of apathetic, disconnected self way. Even the self is unified in this dance. From a certain perspective of spirituality, an orgasm is no different than a hamburger and no different than nuclear war. They're all just phenomenon arising in mind. There was no separation. There never was any. This is what we mean by non-dual. This is the idea. And again, ideas getting real dodgy because this is stuff that goes beyond ideas. That your experience of consciousness is actually through these thousands of little walls you make to sort of create a discrete you with discrete feelings, discrete preferences, discrete ways of being, discrete ideologies and ways of functioning. But in reality, it's all just mind. Even your experience of your body and your phenomenon around you is just mind. You're not actually seeing me. Light is bouncing from my camera from me onto the camera, and all of a sudden translating through electronics and all of a sudden coming back to your eye, and then your brain interprets. Are you actually seeing me? From a certain perspective, there's just interpretation. This is why my community can look at me and see a woman, but a transphobe can come onto this channel and see me as just a mentally ill man. It's not just that they're transphobic. They live in a different world. A dumb, shitty one, but a world nonetheless. Tiamat said, sounds hedonistic. No, not really. For hedonism to be it, there's just pleasure. There's no hue to enjoy. There's pleasure, but there's also not pleasure simultaneously. The sacred and profane are one. There is no spoon. Correct, Patricia. I'll even go one step further. In the Matrix scene where you find out that the Oracle is a machine, suddenly your entire duality of that movie system falls away. Where before you thought there were clear good guys and bad guys, a clear dualism of right and wrong, light and darkness. Why is a program helping people? Already a deconstruction starts happening. I can make a really solid argument for how the Matrix movies not only are an analogy for trans experience, but also a step-by-step example of this actual map. But again, the Wachowski sisters are also fans of Integral. At least were. I don't know if they are now. Yeah, you're empty. Yeah. And what has molecular science found? We're mostly empty space. So again, I don't want to say that this erases anything. This isn't an attempt to start a cult or any bullshit like that. But what I want you to understand is that what we're pointing to is these seem to be universal experiences that human beings have. And they seem to exist regardless of faith, and to some degree, even some similar states, such as peak experiences or whatnot, very similar to witness consciousness, though not quite as far. All of that stuff seems to be universal to human beings. At least that's what Wilbur's argument is, and I tend to believe him on this. These are the states of being: gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. And so the last thing I'll say before we end this part, correct, Clueless, you don't touch other people. There's a whole lot of other shit going on there. It's a lot simpler just to say touch, but it's not fully accurate. So let's do this backwards, and you can kind of get an idea of how this works from a consciousness perspective. And if this map doesn't work for you, that is okay. This is a teaching lesson. I am not trying to sell anyone anything. And I have my own critiques about Wilbur, which we'll be doing at the end of this series. So if everything starts as one, non-dual, and then separates into two, subject, object. And from objective awareness, from the emptiness that is, all of a sudden things arise. They come into being. Maybe they start as a conception, a thought, a feeling. Eventually they become concretized. Two people are in love and they fuck and they make a baby. That baby is now a gross phenomenon with its own interiority, its own consciousness. Fascinating, right? And this keeps going deeper. Essentially what's happening from a Buddhist perspective, if you want to use this mapping, and this has been my experience, Virarona, we're using general metaphor here, calm down. And again, quantum mechanics is not what we're going into. We're just doing very basic chemistry here, atomic structures and all that. And not hardly the point of what we're going on to. So, things start as one, then they become two. Then discrete form arises. First is subtle, then gross. Gross phenomenon decreases, becomes interpretive, becomes eventually subtle, until eventually it all falls away, until there's only emptiness, and eventually it all returns back to oneness. From a Buddhist perspective, this is happening every moment. Every moment of interpretation is the same dance again and again and again.